Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Cutter One. I'm your host, Jay, just Jay, your resident troublemaker and your resident culture warrior. All right, I hope you beautiful badasses are all doing well on this lovely, lovely day. All right, so continuing, if you caught any of the videos from yesterday, you'll know that basically on the 18th was the 20th anniversary of the Two Towers, and so because of that, we saw this spike in sort of Lord of the Rings related articles and stuff that were out there, not just limited to Rings of Power. So the article we're going over now comes to us today, and this comes to us from the website Den of Geek, and let's take a look. It says how Lord of the Rings Eowyn turned a generation of fantasy fans into horse girls. Why Eowyn remains one of the most important characters in Lord of the Rings and in the fantasy genre. All right, let's see what Lacey Bauer has to say. All right. It says, although epic stories like J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings are often associated almost exclusively with the realm of nerdy men, female fantasy fans have long embraced and loved his work. His likable, unabashedly good heroes, his overt rejection of toxic masculinity, and his embrace of universal themes like love, sacrifice, and hope as the greatest powers of every age are all things that speak to very different ideas of strength and leadership that many sprawling fantasy tales than many sprawling fantasy tales of its ilk, quote unquote. Ilk. Okay. Plus, there's no overt sexual menace, and even the most seemingly badass warriors are allowed to be emotionally vulnerable with one another. What's not to love? Unfortunately, female fans have also had to train themselves to overlook the glaring flaw at the center of Tolkien's work and almost all the adaptations that have come from it: how few women are present. And while Prime Video prequel The Rings of Power has made remarkable strides towards correcting this problem, introducing at least a dozen major female characters from a variety of species throughout its sweeping story, fans of the original novels and Peter Jackson's Oscar-winning trilogy of Lord of the Rings films had a lot fewer options to work with when it came to seeing themselves in Tolkien's universe. All right. Thank goodness that one of them was Miranda Otto's Eowyn of Rohan. Yes, she's sadly one of the Lord of the Rings trilogy's only significant female characters, but thankfully she's also one of the story's best, a woman whose unbroken, defiant spirit paved the way for so many who would one day come after her. A human shield maiden and a sort of de facto princess of her uncle King Theoden's court at Edoras, Eowyn is perhaps less outwardly remarkable than the franchise's other female characters. Galadriel and Arwen, after all, are magical elves who are functionally immortal and can bestow life-saving power-ups on the humans and hobbits they favor. But she is nevertheless the franchise's most important woman. But in terms of her role within Tolkien's story, and both in terms of her role within Tolkien's story and her impact on the larger world outside of it. It's no surprise that many female fantasy fans growing up in the early 2000s imprinted on this character at an early age, not only because she is essentially one of their only options within the mega-popular Jackson trilogy, but because her "I am no man" declaration during the Battle of Pelennor Fields feels like it's nothing so much as a rallying cry for women everywhere. And as the film that first brought her to life on screen, The Two Towers, turns 20 this year, it seems like a perfect moment to celebrate not only what makes her character great, but all the ways that the simple fact of her existence helped make space for women in a fandom traditionally dominated by men. All right, I think we can see where this is going to go. For all the ways she's become an epic fantasy icon, Eowyn is still somehow almost shockingly normal. She's a human woman with no special powers or secret abilities. Beyond her skill with the sword, she's essentially taught herself to wield. An obvious horse girl with exceptional riding skills and a mount named Windfola, She clearly shares the same affinity with the animals as the rest of the Rohirrim. Though the fact that her name literally means horse lover in Anglo-Saxon, the language Tolkien used to represent Rohirric, hints that her connection with and or affection for them is likely stronger than most. But Eowyn isn't just a beautiful princess with a loyal steed waiting for a handsome prince, or ranger, or future steward in this case, to show up. She's also the devoted niece and caretaker of her sickly uncle, a trusted leader in her own right, and a girl who chafes under the restrictive expectations of a society that tells her she can't be the warrior she longs to become. If this all sounds extremely familiar, it's because it's also the blueprint for most Disney princess movies in recent years, as Eowyn yearns to be seen and appreciated for who she is, rather than who those around her want her to be, because under her flowing gowns lurks a quiet inner steel, and her horse girl tendencies aren't just a fun personality quirk. Her abilities as a rider are actually a key part of her identity as a warrior. And instead of waiting or asking for a man to save her, the White Lady of Rohan picks up his sword herself and rides into battle, eventually taking down one of the most fearsome monsters in all of Middle-earth along the way. It's honestly hard to overstate how satisfying Eowyn's confrontation with the Witch King of Angmar is, either on page or screen. And her triumph rightly ranks as one of the most famous moments in all of the fantasy genre. The fact the Witch King is ultimately defeated by a woman and a hobbit, so many tried to insist didn't have a proper place in this fight, is not only a perfect narrative moment, but an emotional affirmation that characters like her, and the readers and viewers that love them, have an important role to play in stories like this. Call it projection if you must, but for young women looking for an entry point into this sort of genre fiction, characters like Eowyn matter. She's not an archetype, nor does she exist to tick a representation box. Instead, she feels like a real person with flaws and fears that are specifically her own. And for all that, Eowyn is obviously a badass warrior in her own right. She's not depicted in traditionally masculine terms. She's allowed to be emotional, to express longing, sadness, desire, resentment, and all those other messy things that are almost always coded as female weakness. But those feelings don't make her any less than the men around her here. Instead, those feelings are their own kind of strength. It's her love for Theoden that makes her stay with him during his sickness, and her need to help protect her people that ultimately leads her to pick up a sword and defend them. She clearly cares deeply for Aragorn, but isn't paralyzed by her love for him, and doesn't spend half of the story waiting for him to come back to her. She doesn't need or particularly want to be rescued, and the story doesn't ask her to change in order to emerge victorious or find a partner at the end. And even when she finally decides to marry and hang up her sword at the end of the trilogy, the choice to do so is entirely her own. Is there any wonder female fantasy fans the world over have fallen in love with this character for decades now? A woman who not only carries the hopes of an entire gender on her back in one of the genre's most beloved stories, but who manages to do so without sacrificing her sense of self or her feminine identity. Eowyn may have started off as little more than a horse girl with big dreams, but she ends up forging a path that is entirely her own and bringing a generation of women along with her. And that is from Lacey Bauer. All right. Let's discuss, people. Now, again, if you've seen the previous video I did discussing the character of Eowyn, I like Eowyn as a character. I always have. My sister liked the character, is one of the women that Lacey is referring to in this article, who absolutely fell in love with this character to the point that my sister named my niece Eowyn when she was born. So my niece Eowyn. So would that make me Theoden? I guess in my family dynamic, I'm Theoden. I gotta let the beard grow out then, and gotta let the hair grow a little long. But anyway, I digress. So okay, yes, I fully agree that Eowyn is a strong feminine female character, and I know it sounds weird to say a feminine female character, but what I mean by that is juxtapose that with strong female characters that we have gotten in the past, say, 10 years, right? Whether it be Rey Skywalker or Guy Ladriel. A lot of today's strong women characters are strong because they're not feminine. They're sort of, the writers feel that in order to make them strong, you have to make them less feminine, right? And they have to be more masculine. Like, look at Guy Ladriel from Rings of Power, okay? For a female elf, she is the most unfeminine of female elves I've ever seen, right? She is literally walking around like a dude with an attitude, okay? Whereas Eowyn in Peter Jackson's trilogy, she's strong and independent and strong-willed, but yet she just doesn't lose her femininity. She's very feminine in what she does. So she still has those traits, like the article pointed out, right? And I'm not necessarily going to take a shit on everything that Lacey Bauer said, because a lot of it I agree with. Some of it I don't. Like saying Theoden had some sickness, you could say that, I suppose. I mean, I think that wouldn't be the correct wording that you would use for it, because it wasn't just like he caught the flu or the plague. There was some elements of magic and manipulation and stuff going on between Saruman and Wormtongue, working on Theoden to put him into that state. So just chalking it up to, her quote unquote sickly uncle, I think is kind of goofy. But yes, I think Eowyn is unique in that she is a good combination of it. It shows what Rings of Power should have done, right? With if they were going to go the warrior Princess Galadriel thing, right? They could have handled it better. Like even conceptually, they dropped the ball on that one, and Peter Jackson had given them the blueprint, right? Eowyn in those films is the blueprint. Now, while I understand why a lot of female fantasy genre fans hold the character of Eowyn up as I guess an optimal version of what a female within the context of a fantasy genre can be, I do think a couple of things get missed by a lot of people. One of the things that I feel, and this is just, now we're drifting into sort of my overview on things, my take on it. I think while the character of Eowyn does in fact represent that, it rightly gives women with a feminist mindset a character to latch onto, right? There's no denying that, right? But I think the point that gets missed is why Tolkien chose to do that, right? And how her story arc actually plays out. See, most of the articles that we're seeing now, and a lot of, when you talk to a lot of female fantasy fans, and the topic of Eowyn within the Lord of the Rings comes up, be it the movie or the books, they're very much aware of her the feminist aspect of it. I am no man. She's the one that has to, the only one that could have killed the Witch King, and so on and so forth. But I think what Tolkien was going for with her character, right? Now, and hear me out on this one. Tolkien, having been a veteran of the trench warfare of World War I, right? Which means he was also a veteran, if you will, of the propaganda and romanticization. Is that even a word? The romanticizing of war, right? And for the folks that went off to World War I, it was World War I before, it entered into the history books. At the beginning, it was this very romanticized thing, right? You were going off to fight for your country and God and king and whatever, right? And a lot of men were volunteering to do this because it was adventure, it was glory, right? Adventure and glory of war, right? It's nothing new. It's an old song and dance. We've all heard it before. The adventure and glory of war, right? And I think Tolkien understood that. But then, having actually fought in the war, he saw that it's not the glorious romantic endeavor that is often portrayed to civilians in order to get them to participate in the war, right? It's all glory and adventure when you're you're at home, but once you're in the trenches and you're seeing the guys around you, get their heads blown off, every day, not knowing when the bullet with your name is coming, and having to step over blood and guts and stuff like that of guys that you were having coffee with that morning. He knew that war is not adventure. There's no glory in war. It's not an adventurous endeavor. It's a brutal, horrible, disgusting display of mankind's failure. That's how I would describe it, right? So Tolkien knew that, right? But he knew how, to a civilian population, it gets romanticized and it's glorified, right? This sense of adventure and glory. Eowyn, in the books and largely in Peter Jackson's adaptation, Eowyn, she's sort of that civilian that's under that spell. She wants to get out there with the guys and partake in the glory of defending Rohan, the glory of fighting for Rohan, right? She has that romanticized idea of what going out to the front and fighting is, right? Because she's heard Éomer and the other men talk of this stuff, and it's sort of this romanticized vision she has of it. And so that's why she wants to participate, right? And of course, there's the other elements as well of, the whole patriarchal aspect of it, right? But I think that's not nearly as important to Éowyn's character arc as a lot of people would assume. I think the more important part is, like I said, she has this idealized, romanticized vision of what it means to be a shield maiden and going out and fighting for Rohan and defending Rohan. And because she has that romanticized vision, she wants to participate in it. She wants to do it. Now, I don't think it's because the woman need to know her place, right? That all these Éomer and all these other folks try to prevent her from doing that. And this is where context is key, I always say. And I think a lot of feminists would be wise to hear the words that I'm about to say. And that is, sometimes as men, we don't want women to do certain things, not because we think less of women, but because we know the brutal truths of how those things play out and what happens in those things. And we're trying to protect the women that we know from those things, okay? And that is a natural instinct in men. And I know some people say, oh, toxic masculinity. Well, if toxic masculinity is me wanting to protect the women that I care about and love from the ugliness and horribleness out in the world, then you know what? I'm okay with being a toxic masculine male, because that is my natural instinct. My niece named Eowyn, my sister, my wife, my daughter, I want to protect them from the ugliness of the world. I don't want to send them out into it. And that doesn't mean because I'm trying to, quote unquote, keep them in their place. It means that I care, right? So, that aside, that's why I think Éomer and the others try to say, hey, you shouldn't, they're not cool with the idea of her going out and fighting, right? But they do, when shit really hits the fan, they do get her involved. At Helm's Deep, she is given a sword and told to defend the women and children in the caves, right? She's told to defend the women and children. That is and I said it in the other video, that is the most manly thing you could possibly do. You want to be equal with a man, ladies? Go out and defend women and children. That is the most manly thing that men do. Okay? It's not boxing, it's not weightlifting, it's not, being rich or running a company. No, the most manly thing a guy can do is protect women and children. That is what we are naturally hardwired to do. Okay? And there's nothing wrong with it. Okay, and it doesn't take away from women and it doesn't take away from children. It's the way, the nature, the way we are built as human beings, right? Men, we are designed more for physical endeavors, okay? And women have a different skill set that they are naturally better at than men. It's just a different skill set, right? But to bring it back to Eowyn, she is given a sword and told to protect the men and women. She doesn't want to do it. Why does she not want to do it? Why does she chafe at that idea? Okay, in the other article, they sort of alluded to it, because to a person with that feminist ideology, that's not good enough. You want to do it on your terms. And Eowyn's terms is this glorified, romanticized sense of battle and duty and honor and glory and stuff. So being in a dark cave with a bunch of crying children and scared women, but being the one assigned to protect them is still not good enough, because she's still chasing that romanticized idea of war and glory. Okay? Peter Jackson shows this because when we get to the Battle of Pelennor Fields, right? And Eowyn's there. Peter Jackson does a really good thing. If you remember the movies, there's the scene where the Fell Beast and the Witch King swoops down and he grabs Theoden on his horse. And he sort of thrashes him around, right? And while he's thrashing him around, you cut to a scene of Miranda Otto as Eowyn, and she has this look on her face of complete and utter shock and horror, right? It's pure, unadulterated shock and horror. Wide eyes, mouth agape, completely shock and horror. And then obviously Theoden gets thrown down and she steps in and warns the Witch King, if you touch him, I'll kill you. And then she proceeds to follow through on that threat, kills the Fell Beast, takes out the Witch King, right? Then Theoden dies in her arms, right? They have that whole thing where he's like, Eowyn, I know your face, and so on and so forth, right? And he dies in her arms. And she's obviously upset. And at the same time, in the movie, Peter Jackson then cuts to, you see Eowyn seeing Éomer cradling the body of a fallen rider of Rohan. I believe it's the guy who was Theoden's second in command at Helm's Deep, but I'm not sure. Someone correct me about that in the comments. But, you see Éomer, and he's thoroughly like crying out in agony at the death of his friend and stuff. And you see all these people crying, and in such emotional pain because of all this death that's happened, right? In the book, okay, now that's where most of these feminists will stop right there, right? Eowyn had her "I am no man," and she's something that little girls could look up to, and that's fine. But I think they're missing the point, because if you read the books, you know that eventually Eowyn actually hangs up her sword very shortly after this, right? And she actually has a quote, and I have the quote up here, so just bear with me. Um, da, 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 da. Uh, I'm just trying to find it here. Sorry about that, guys. Give me 1 second. Give me 1 second. I had it marked. I thought I had it marked. Damn it. I had it marked. Um, shit. All right. I think I may have accidentally closed the page on that one. But the point I was trying to make is she eventually hangs up her sword, and she chooses to be a healer. Right at the time when she's marrying Faramir. Because she's seen the heart. Her story arc is that she understands the misinterpretation, or she understands how she was believing in this idea of war as a glorious adventure, and then she got a taste of the real horrors of it, right? The brutality of it, the ugliness of it, and it changes her perspective on it. She no longer needs to be out there fighting. She can be the queen of Rohan, and she becomes a healer. She's no longer about death and destruction. She wants to heal and build and grow things, right? And I think that's the real story arc there. It's not, and I hate to say this because it sounds bad, it's not this whole empowerment issue. It's more of an issue of her character arc is she's starting like Tolkien and most of the men of his generation as somebody who believes these stories that war is this glorious adventure, and fortune and glory, and it's overly romanticized and sold to them. And then war finally comes and you're all gung-ho for it because you have this vision that's overly romanticized and glorified. And then you get in there and you finally get to war and you see it for all its ugly brutality. And Eowyn, for all of her empowerment that a lot of female fans of her has, and even I give her as a male fan of the character, at the end of the day, she realizes she was wrong. For as much as she wanted to go out and fight like the guys, when she got a taste of it, she does it once and she's like, fuck this, I'll be a healer. Because she sees it for what it really is. It's not a glorious romantic adventure. It's an ugly, nasty business, right? And she understands that. And that's the real growth of her story. So I guess to wrap this up, because I kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent, I think the articles, I don't have that much of an issue with it. I mean, there's sort of some undertones there that are sort of like, grr, you just don't like men. But I mean, for the most part, I agree with a lot of what they're saying about Eowyn. I just think that they missed the point. I think they missed the point of why Tolkien gave her that particular story arc like that. Now, that doesn't mean that Tolkien didn't also want to reflect some of like, hey, guys, we need to let women be themselves and have the freedom to make their own choices and decisions and let they control the way their life plays out and so on and so forth. I think that some of it was there. I mean, I think Tolkien would be the first to say that he was not in any way Edith's boss. And for those of you who may not be familiar, Edith was his wife. I don't think Tolkien would ever say that he was Edith's boss, right? So I think that maybe some of it, but I think more importantly is he used the character of Eowyn was sort of showing that innocent naivete that most young people have when it comes to something like war, and how unfortunately the powers that be can manipulate that view of what war is about, what war is like. And so you almost crave it. You crave that you need to go out there and prove yourself and have this sense of adventure and fortune and glory, only to find out that it's nasty, nasty, nasty and ugly. And I think that's ultimately Eowyn's story arc. But I could be wrong. But, I think that that's something that most of the more feminist-leaning people that look at Eowyn and hail her as some great feminist icon, they forget that part. They forget that part. To them, it's all about she's just wanting to do what the guys do, and nobody's letting her do what the guys do, and that's kind of fucked up, and patriarchy and stuff. And I'm like, I think a lot of the motivations that Tolkien gives to Éomer and Theoden for wanting to keep her away from that stuff is because they're trying to say, hey, look, this is an ugly fucking business, this whole war and fighting thing. It's an ugly business, and we don't want that for you. We think you deserve better. I don't know a guy on this planet, even today in 2022, that would want his girlfriend or wife or fiance or daughter or mother or to go out and have to fight a war. I mean, crap. I mean, look at what's going on in Ukraine. Okay, what was one of the first thing the Ukrainians did? They send the women and children out of the country because naturally men just don't want women to have to go through that. War is an ugly fucking business, people. And so I don't think it was trying to keep Eowyn down as a woman so much as it was trying to protect her as a human being from the ugliness that is the reality of war. And her character story arc was based on her buying into this fortune and glory aspect of a romanticized vision of war. And then when she finally, through sheer willpower and her own prowess, I'll give her that, gets to participate in a war, she sees exactly how ugly it is and how it's not the romanticized thing. But anyway, that's my opinion. What do you guys think? Let me know what you think down in the comments below. I'm curious. I guess the question would be, do you think Eowyn's story arc is more like what I was describing, that Tolkien sort of used her as a sort of a way of getting across that whole idea that war is not this pretty romanticized thing that we often give it, that we often make it out to be, and he uses Eowyn's character to sort of illustrate that, as well as the feminist side of it. I think that's in there too. I'm not taking away from that. I'm not saying that that doesn't exist, but I don't think that's the whole story. I think that's part of the picture that Tolkien created with the character. But let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Remember, if you like the video. If you feel like sharing the video, that would be awesome because it gets seen by more people. If you have not subscribed, I would hope that you would consider subscribing to the channel. We go into some pretty heavy Tolkien stuff, and we'll call out, attacks on Tolkien wherever we find them. And if you have subscribed, thank you very much for being part of this journey. You are a beautiful badass. All right, folks, that's going to do it for this one. I will see you on the next one. Remember, be good, be safe, be awesome, and I'll talk to you later. Bye. Peace.